afternoon, faculty and students. My name is Nishi and today I'll be discussing learned helplessness in association with student motivation and technology dependence. To preface my presentation, I would first like to introduce the topic of learned helplessness and define it for everybody. Learned helplessness is defined as a perception of no control even when change is possible. For example, let's say you're a student and you're taking a standardized exam, such as the SAT. You want to obtain a score of, let's say, a 1400, and you're practicing as much as you can to get as many questions correct. One of the notoriously easier sections, such as the grammar sections, is one that you personally struggle with. You do as much practice as you can, and you still seem to get the questions wrong again and again. And eventually, as you keep taking the questions, you realize that you have less motivation to get the 1400, and you eventually give up, stating that the 1400 is not attainable not just because of what you're doing, but because it's out of your control. That's one of the many ways that learned helplessness can manifest in education. And in an academic setting, this can look like students giving up on their assignments or tests because they feel as though they're doomed to fail, regardless of if they are actually able to succeed or not. In terms of student motivation, before we delve into the effects of learned helplessness on student learning, we must address these three factors. In an interview with Edward L. Dici, a critical psychologist who has influential theories in intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, he stated these three factors as most influential in student motivation. Number one is a student's competence of efficacy, which means their understanding of how well they can complete a task. Number two is a student's self-autonomy or initiation to learn, meaning their willingness to do something. And number three is that student's relatability to other students in their classroom. After researching the psychological roots of motivation, I began to notice a growing trend that may have an effect on all three of these areas, and that is a student's dependence on artificial intelligence and technological platforms to subset any sort of lack of motivation they have in studies. In fact, according to the Digital Education Council, 86% of students claim to use artificial intelligence in their studies, and of those 86% of students, as many as 24% use artificial intelligence daily. As I dug deeper into how students were using artificial intelligence, I found more than just these statistics. It was incredibly clear that the obvious mindset that students had when using artificial intelligence was to subset the lack of motivation they have. In fact, the convenience of artificial intelligence tools can be incredibly helpful, but there is a growing concern that this convenience comes at this cost. According to the National Library of Medicine, it is in fact clear that as students and as individuals rely more on artificial intelligence, it increases the loss of human decision-making capabilities, which starts to have users automate their tasks. And this, in turn, reduces engagement with any sort of learning that a student may have if they're using platforms with technology and artificial intelligence involved. Reading these expert insights made me pause and reflect on student passivity and technological reliance. And in my research, I wanted to explore not just whether students were using any sort of technological aid in their studies, but how that might be shaping their mindset and how they're learning. Therefore, I narrowed everything down into one research question. And that allowed for me to really understand the connection between a loss of motivation and how students depend on technology, and allowed for me to address that gap. Therefore, my research question came to be, to what extent does learned helplessness influence academic productivity in technology-integrated high schools? I landed on this question to then understand a little bit more about how learned helplessness, how students anticipate and look at their studies, how that lack of motivation that they have can be addressed and have some sort of a connection and association with any technology that they might be using. After looking into my question and doing further literature review, I then landed on my hypothesis that there is a significant association between low motivation and reliance on technology. This prediction was based on numerous factors. For one, the motivational framework that I had discussed earlier, as well as psychological concerns around over-automation, as well as behavioral trends I was already seeing in schools. And if my hypothesis did prove to be correct, it would then suggest that increasing technology doesn't necessarily just change how students are just completing their tasks, rather it changes their mental focus, their engagement, and empowerment in their education. To learn more about my hypothesis and address my research question, I designed a quantitative survey design for my methodology. In terms of how I was going to obtain the results and what I was going to do with them, I utilized descriptive and correlational analysis of behaviors to better understand how the quantitative data that I got would influence my understanding and the correlation that I found between motivation and technology reliance. In terms of the rationale of my survey, I utilized a survey because a survey allows for broad data collection. Additionally, the quantitative analysis that I would be using allows for me to clearly identify correlations between two various variables with students, and it specifically allows for me to look into my sample and really see what is affecting their thinking and how they're perceiving the questions that I'm asking them. Before I released my survey and before I went ahead and started gathering participants for my sample, I made sure to uphold all ethical integrity and responsibility. For one, I was interviewing many students who were under the age of 18 at North Brunswick Township High School. That meant that I had to obtain not only their consent, but parental consent. So as I released my survey and started telling participants about what I was doing, I had a letter prepared for them to give to their parents, which allowed for them to both be aware about what the survey was going to ask. And after everybody filled out the survey, that is only when I released the survey to the students. Additionally, I made sure to give my proposal into the North Brunswick Township High School Ethics Board in order for them to look over my methodology and approve everything in order for it to be not only just ethical for North Brunswick Township High School standards, but ethical for students and to protect their privacy as well. In terms of my respondents and the prerequisites that I had for them, I made sure that all respondents were from North Brunswick Township High School in grades 9 through 12. And I did this because this population was very easily accessible to me. And in addition to that, I made sure that they were in our high school because I am personally in this high school and I know the extent to which our school is technology integrated. Additionally, I made sure to include students that had variations of grades. Students that were high achieving versus students that were maybe struggling in a few classes. I made sure to include numerous types of students in order for my findings to be generalizable to the greater population. In terms of the questions that I asked in the survey, I made sure to address two main things. Number one, motivational patterns, which is how confident and engaged students were in their learning. And number two, their technology behaviors, which means that how often they rely on technology to complete academic tasks. Here are some of the types of questions that I asked. For one, some of the questions that I asked were scenario-based. The first question I have displayed here shows how a student may rate their overall experience with academic tasks in school from a scale of very positive to very negative. The second type of question that I asked was a ranking question that allowed for students to rank on a scale of 1 to 4 the most important to least important facet on their academic success. In terms of the analytical approach that I took after I obtained my survey results, I used descriptive statistics and correlational analysis to further understand the trends in my data, as well as the correlations that could come of it. The first question that I addressed through descriptive analysis was the question that asked students about rating what allows for them to succeed academically. Specifically, because I was looking at motivation, I looked at the mean rating of effort and persistence in terms of the ranking from a scale of 1 to 4. After obtaining my responses over the course of 1 month, here are the results from that specific part of my survey. For one, the sample size that I had was 30 students, and by the central limit theorem, that allows for me to generalize the population in a normal distribution. So in terms of that, I made this graph. So a frequency of about 19 students responded with effort and persistence being number 1 as most important in academic success, and 11 other students rated that otherwise. In terms of the sample mean, it was 1.83, indicating that many students rely on their effort and persistence in order for them to be academically successful. That allowed for me to get a greater insight into how important it was for a student to be motivated when learning and for them to be emotionally and cognitively aware when they're overcoming something difficult. That led me into my second analysis, which was for more so of a qualitative question. I asked students when they face a challenging task, how do they feel? Of the 30 students responding, a majority of roughly 2/3 of students said that they feel overwhelmed and often give up, whereas 1/3 said in total they either feel motivated to tackle the task or they feel frustrated yet they keep trying. With that in mind, I continued to look at patterns in my data to understand how this mindset connects to a student's relationship with technology and their overall academic motivation. With that being said, the next statistical test that I did was a chi-square test for independence. A chi-square test for independence allows for me to look at the association between two different variables, specifically the variable of motivation and variable of technological reliance. In my chi-square test for independence, I first looked at a null hypothesis of no association being between poor academic experience and reliance on technology. My alternative hypothesis here was that there is an association between poor academic experience and reliance on technology. That alternative hypothesis was in alignment with my own hypothesis, and this chi-square test allowed for me to test these two variables against one another. Here are the results of my chi-square test. The first question that I asked that I used in this chi-square test was the question that I had showed before. A student's academic experience on a scale of very positive to very negative. The second question, which you can see at the top row, indicates how often a student uses technology in their schooling. Occasionally, once a week, several times a week, and daily were all responses that were reported. And after using a significance level of 0.05, I obtained a p-value, or a probability, of 0.04. Because the p-value 0.04 was less than the significance value of 0.05, we are able to reject the null hypothesis here of no association, and we in fact do have convincing evidence that there is an association between negative academic experience and reliance on technology. Now, with the research that I've conducted, because I did use a population that was limited to our high school, there were two limitations that I found as important to address. Number one is that students filling out my survey may have had a social desirability bias. That bias means that students filling out my survey, they might have given a response that is technically desirable by me. Let's say they don't want to say that they rely on technology as much, they want to look as though they are more engaged with their learning. They could respond in a way that is more desirable for me, who is the researcher. And that is one of the limitations to my research. The second limitation is that we had a lack of response variability. Because I was only sampling students at North Brunswick Township High School, other schools may be more technologically integrated and other schools might not be. So my results are not necessarily applicable to every school. However, with the data that I have and with the inferences and conclusions I made, I'm able to further inference other things for other schools depending on how technologically advanced they are and how integrated they are with learning and student availability and awareness in regards to how they're learning and their motivation. In terms of the implications of my research, if students continue to use a reliance on technology to subset a lack of motivation, it may cause any of the following. For one, students might have avoidance behaviors and avoid confronting any sort of academic challenge that they have because they then rely on technology to go and subset that for them. Let's say a student is struggling with an assignment and they feel as though it's too difficult for them to complete. The student can easily go ahead and go into online platforms such as ChatGPT to do it for them. And that avoidance behavior then goes into reduced perseverance. If a student is consistently using any sort of online platform for them to have their assignments completed, for them to offset any lack of motivation they have, that results in a reduced perseverance. And that means that student is not challenging themselves to take it up to the next level and to really learn about what they need to be learning and filling in any of the mistakes and gaps in their knowledge. After this continues for a long period of time, this causes a negative feedback loop. If these students are consistently using online technology in order to offset any lack of motivation they have, that causes them to have less of a learning experience, and it results in them being less inclined to take that next step to learn something further. In terms of what we can do, not just as students and not just as faculty, but as people in a school with engaging with students every day, there are many recommended actions that we can take. I have here listed 3. Number 1 is a process-oriented feedback implemented by educators. Process-oriented feedback would consist of educators talking to students and giving them scaffolding, the thing that they need to in turn increase their motivation and allow for them to feel more inclined to learn and feel more engaged with their learning. The second part is more so on the students, but as well as the teachers for them to reinforce, is integrating reflective practice. Reflection has shown and been proven to allow for students to feel more engaged with their learning because they're looking at something that they feel like they're lacking on. If they have a gap in their knowledge, reflecting allows for them to address that gap and feel more inclined intrinsically to resolve that by taking the steps that they need to take in order for them to learn. Lastly, it is important that we take the 2 recommended actions from earlier, the process-oriented feedback and reflective practice, and integrate that into our modern curriculums. Many of the curriculums that are commonly seen in schools are reflective of the technology integration of the past. many curriculums have not been yet adapted to account for that technological dependence that students have. And if we alter curriculums and allow for that factor to be addressed, we're able to not just support students in their independent learning, but we're able to support them properly in terms of motivating them to learn. Of course, with the steps that I've displayed, there is a weakness. Students might feel resistant to implement these changes into their life. As well, they might feel some withdrawals in terms of using technology to subset their education. That, however, can be addressed through student voice. If students have a say in the new curriculums that are being taught to them, that gives them more of a reason to be engaged with that. Meaning that if a student is able to vocalize what they want in their curriculum versus what they do not like, that allows for that student to feel more motivated intrinsically to work with a teacher, as well as rely less on technology because they have a say in what they're learning. Overall, that allows for students to take ownership of their learning, and in turn allows for them to be motivated and overcome learned helplessness entirely. Thank you, and here's my work site.
Okay. After you chose your project goal, which information guided your choice of a research method?
Of course. So the information that guided my choice after I was looking into these factors was more specifically on student motivation and how students are motivated in modern settings. A lot of the research that I found was in relation to student motivation modernly rather than student motivation in terms of technological dependence and how that influences them. What really captured my eye was how students were starting to be motivated less and less. And I started to see this trend consistently in all of the literature I was reviewing. And that made me really look into why that was happening and what external factors could cause that to happen. Then that allowed for me to start looking into factors that I was thinking about, such as technology, how classrooms have changed over the years, COVID-19. And after I reviewed literature, I started to realize how much students were relying on technology. That made me form the connection between both, and that allowed for me to then develop my research for my question.
Thank you.
Okay, if you could have one ideal audience member to be present here for your presentation that you feel would benefit the most from listening to your presentation, who would that be and why?
I would definitely say it's a small group of people, but those who have been caught using artificial intelligence or any sort of unethical practice in their education. This is really eye-opening for those who have been consistently relying on technology for the work that they're doing, and for those who are not taking ownership of their learning. I feel as though this presentation is very much targeted towards those audiences because it allows for them to reflect. As I was saying, reflective practice is very essential in order for a student to grow. This presentation is eye-opening because it allows for them to reflect on trends that we've seen, and not only does it show the association between low motivation and technology reliance, it shows how critical it is for us to address this and how it's affecting a student's intrinsic learning as well as their emotional and cognitive development. That crowd of students would be beneficial to have here today so that they can understand a little bit more about what is affecting their knowledge and how it could affect them negatively.
Think about the initial curiosity that led to your inquiry. What other areas of inquiry might that same curiosity lead to?
So in terms of what originally motivated me, I was very motivated to look into a student's mentality. Now, when I was researching, I was looking a lot into motivation, but there are many other facets that I could apply this to. For instance, I could apply it to student cases of violence. Let's say there are students who are motivated to do harmful things to students. In our modern educational setting, there are higher cases of gun violence and violence in schools. Now, looking into motivation of how students have low motivation for technology, I would like to then look into motivation that students have to do harmful things to other students. Of course, that's a bad thing, and it's important that we're addressing that. And I think that looking into the motivation that students have, both for good things, for bad things, is very important because it allows for us to look into what is influencing our current academic environment. And of course, looking at the negative and positive aspects of our environment is critical. And by using that initial curiosity that I had to look at student motivation, I would then use that for something good. Looking into something about student violence and how to prevent that would be a great way for me to apply that initial curiosity I had for motivation and turn that into something good in order to prevent harmful acts to our student community.
Any other questions at all?